You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Erin McLaughlin, Senior Economist at the Conference Board and guest host of today's episode. In today's conversation, we'll discuss the latest U.S. Consumer Confidence Index, as well as our outlook for the global economy. Joining me today is Dana Peterson, Chief Economist and Leader of the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board. Welcome, Dana.
Hi, Erin. So great to be here.
Thank you. Great to have you. Well, let's get started right away with what was released today, the November U.S. Consumer Confidence Survey. What is our biggest takeaway from what we saw today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that consumers are continuing to feel optimistic, and a lot of it's being driven by the jobs market. They think that jobs are more easy to get currently and that they will be available 6 months from now.
Okay. So what happened to the index this month compared to last month or what we've seen recently?
Sure. Well, the index continued to tick higher. We saw a pretty big improvement in October, and that just continued in November. And for the most part, it was both the present situation and expectations that rose in the month.
Okay. Now, did we see any differentiation between age or income or other sort of categories with those surveyed?
Sure. So people who were younger than 35 and also people who made more than $125,000 a year were the happiest in the month.
Okay.
We did see a pullback among folks who were, kind of middle-aged between 35 and 55. They weren't as optimistic in the month, but for the most part, just about every income group rose, except for the folks who were on the lower end of the spectrum and then also on the highest end. So let me just fix the first thing I said in terms of incomes. I think as people who were making around 100,000, they were okay, but people making more than that were more concerned about what's going on in the economy.
So what is driving sort of the change in the present situation?
Sure. Once again, it was really driven by employment. So more people felt that jobs were easier to get relative to hard to get. And that's really good news. When it came to business conditions, people were a little less optimistic. But certainly when it comes to jobs, people are saying, hey, look, I can get out there and find employment if I need to.
Okay. So that's really influencing the expectations measure is sort of that positive feeling about the labor market.
Yeah, for expectations, we ask about the labor market, business conditions, and income. And yes, again, expectations for all those measures picked up in the month, but especially for beliefs about what employment will look like a half year from now.
Okay. And so what were consumers saying about the recession?
Well, it's interesting. We've been asking this question since July of 2022, and we reached a new low. So
Oh, excellent.
fewer and fewer consumers believe that a recession is on the way.
All right. Well, that would make sense if they're feeling good about what the next 6 months or 6 months from now will look like. So how are these consumers viewing the future of inflation?
Well, inflation expectations also found kind of a new low. They fell to the lowest level we've seen since March of 2020. And March of 2020 was pretty much when the US shut down. So we pretty much have seen a normalization of 1 year inflation expectations. And that's great. We think consumers are noticing that prices are not rising as quickly as they had been. Indeed, when we look at consumer inflation measures, headline CPI and also the PCE deflator are hovering just above 2%. Now, the core measures are a little bit sticky. They're not as close, but we're still very far away from the 7% inflation we saw for the PCE deflator at its peak and the 9% inflation we saw for the CPI at its peak.
Well, I'm glad that both the expectation and the actual measure of inflation is coming down. So what do consumers believe about interest rates and the stock market?
Well, really great news. They believe that the stock market is going to continue to rise. In fact, we reached, I think, a high level on that measure since we've been asking it.
Yes.
And that's also consistent with what we're seeing in the stock market right now. There's a lot of exuberance about what we should expect in the next administration, potentially lower tax cuts, potentially deregulation. Those things are certainly exciting for investors, and I think consumers are picking up on that. When it comes to interest rates, they're growing even more confident that interest rates will be lower next year than they are this year. However, we caution that while the Fed has said that the election results don't have any impact on the December federal funds rate because the next administration doesn't start until January, but there's still a lot of uncertainty around what interest rates will look like next year. Indeed, we highlight the fact that there may be more tariffs coming, and that would certainly raise inflation for consumers and cause the Fed to not cut interest rates as much as we thought before the election.
Right. I mean, I think that that just makes the survey, our regular US Consumer Confidence Survey, even more valuable as we look to how it might change in the months to come. So, for those that we're surveying, how do they feel personally about their finances with regards to other, obviously within the context of the employment and inflation and other themes?
Yes, so thoughts about their current financial situation were positive on net, but just a little less positive. But when it came to expectations for the future, on net, it was more positive. And indeed, there was a big uptick in those thinking that their financial situation 6 months from now will be better. And those thinking that it would be worse was pretty much unchanged.
So, obviously, as you mentioned, a lot of economic policy and sort of what may happen in our near future in 2025, in a lot of people's minds, also depends on the new administration and different changes, including tariffs, et cetera. Did our folks that we were surveying talk about the political environment post-election? And maybe you could describe a little bit of the timing of the survey around the election as well.
Sure. So the survey spanned the beginning of November all the way through November 18th. So we had a pretty good sampling, and the election was in the first couple of days of the
Right.
of
And a
the
lot of
month.
people early voted. Yes, they had voted. Right.
Right. But I mean, the key thing is that we had several weeks after the election for
After,
people to process.
yeah.
And when we ask consumers to name something that they think will have a big impact on the economy, they write it in and we aggregate all the mentions. And so elections or anything political actually displaced prices as the number one thing. Prices were still
Okay.
pretty high. They were pretty much neck and neck, but
Okay.
you know, elections tick just slightly above prices. And certainly when we looked at the number of mentions around elections this November compared to November 2020 and November 2016, we saw a huge pop well above November 2020, but it was still not as high as November 2016. So all it's telling us is that, yes, consumers are very focused on the election, but more so what's to come after the elections.
Okay. Now, what are consumers' buying plans regarding durable goods?
Sure, consumers are still desiring to buy a car, and their desires are the highest for purchasing used cars. New cars kind of has flattened out over the last few years. It's ticking up a little bit this year, but it's really not much better than it was even 3 years ago. So most consumers are focused on used cars, probably because they're just less expensive. When it comes to buying a home, that kind of bottomed out earlier this year, but we've seen a little bit of an uptick over the last few months. I mean, it's still very weak, but I think the fact that anticipation that interest rates are going to fall, or at least continue to fall, is probably prompting some people to come back into the labor market and figure, by the middle of next year, conditions will be better for purchasing a home. When it comes to other big ticket items like appliances and tech, people, kind of pulled back a little bit in terms of what they were thinking. But for the most part, consumers are really looking at those larger purchases like cars and homes.
Okay, interesting. Now, how about spending on services?
Yes, it's interesting. We asked about spending on services across almost 20 different categories, and just about every category ticked down slightly in the month, with the exception of travel and healthcare. So,
Okay.
so it's funny. Travel is the most discretionary service you could possibly buy, and healthcare is probably the most basic,
The-
fundamental
Right. Yes.
service. So they're saying, look, we want to go on vacation, but we also need to be healthy. But in general, when we compared desires to buy goods versus services, consumers still had a slightly higher preference towards goods relative to services. But still, now when I look at the ranking of what people plan to buy in terms of services, it's still the case that restaurants, travel, streaming, and healthcare are all pretty high, and things that consumers are going to spend less on are things like childcare and educational services, but also entertainment. So it seems like they're going to the hotel and just hanging out there. So maybe they're going to all inclusives. Who knows?
Or they're doing the Netflix at home, that they're streaming but not
Well,
going
they
out.
are. Well, they are going to the movies. Yes, that really popped up. So I think
Okay.
we had some great movies come out this fall. So I think that's maybe drawing people in.
Yes. So what are they? Obviously, a lot of this is very, very positive, but what are consumers most concerned about for 2025?
Yes, we asked that special question in November, and they basically said that higher prices were their top concern. And certainly that makes sense after several years of very elevated prices and very rapid inflation. They were also concerned about higher taxes, wars and conflict, and social unrest. Those are the big things that they were very much concerned about. And certainly next year, we do have the tax cliff, where individual tax cuts will expire unless Congress acts. And certainly we have seen, a ramping up in wars and conflict around the globe that could potentially impact the US. So those are the big things that consumers are really concerned about for next year. In terms of the things that they're really hopeful about, as I mentioned earlier, household finances, better household finances, which is something that was at the top of the list. They also hope to be able to save more money, pay lower taxes, and also pay down their debt.
Okay. So what does consumer confidence tell us about household spending ahead?
Well, I think it's still very constructive. I mean, the consumer throughout 2024 has continued to surprise to the upside in terms of their spending. They're spending on goods and they're spending on services. And of course, the composition of services is kind of odd. It skews very heavily towards travel and streaming. On the discretionary end, but on the things that are necessary, they're very much focused on healthcare and also making sure that their cars are running. But even with all that, consumers continue to spend, and I think that is a function of the fact that the labor market's been very strong, and consumers have been highlighting that in our measure of consumer confidence. So as long as we continue to see strong gains in the labor market, which means companies are not letting their workers go, inflation stays pretty modest, and we don't see a surge in inflation due to any changes in major changes in policy, that consumers can continue to spend. And it seems like, the important thing is that they're looking to spend on things that are very expensive, like vacations are not cheap, cars are pricey, and certainly if you buy a home, you're going to buy all sorts of things that go in the home,
They
like
go in the home.
appliances and
Yes.
tech and et cetera. So I think it's all quite constructive.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to go take a short break and be right back with more of my conversation with Dana Peterson.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Erin McLaughlin, Senior Economist at the Conference Board. I'm joined by Dana Peterson, Chief Economist and Leader of the Economy Strategy and Finance Center at the Conference Board. So Dana, what is our outlook for the global economy as we close 2024 and enter 2025?
Sure. For 2024, the global economy is probably going to grow by about 3%. And we think that is also possible for next year. But it's really about the composition of growth. The U.S. certainly was a leader in growth this year, Also, India was a huge driver of emerging market growth. China saw weaker growth this year, um, but still in all, we're probably going to see growth that's not terribly slow this year. Next year, a little bit slower. Europe has been a mixed bag. We've
Mhm.
seen health in some economies, but certainly Germany's been kind of the sick man. A lot of that's probably going to continue next year, but there's certainly a lot of risk to that outlook for roughly 3% global GDP growth.
Okay. So which economies do we think are potentially going to drive growth next year?
Well, again, I think the US has a good opportunity to drive growth, and China will probably see slower growth, but it'll still be quite robust. But India, we think this is India's decade. They've spent a lot of time and effort investing in infrastructure and homegrown businesses and educating their young people for, frankly, the businesses of the future. Also, India is being looked at by more and more companies as a place to set up their supply chains for diversification, certainly diversifying their supply chains relative to being, wholly dependent upon China. So I think those, two big economies should see faster growth. Also, just across the world, especially emerging markets and particularly Latin America, they got ahead of the inflation problem before the advanced economies did. They hiked interest rates and they've also been lowering interest rates first. So that's probably also going to provide a boost to economic growth for next year to offset some of the areas where there will be weakness.
Okay. So what sorts of policies from the US post-election will most affect the global economy? And of course, I know tariffs is definitely one of them that we are focused on.
Yes, I think tariffs is probably one of the bigger ones. Certainly,
Mhm.
U.S. relations in terms of geopolitical matters, but when it comes to the economy, absolutely. If the U.S. begins increasing tariffs on certain economies or imposing new tariffs on economies, then certainly that can weigh on global growth. So, for example, there was a recent announcement by the incoming administration that they may potentially impose pretty significant tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and
Mhm.
China. Now
Right.
we've run some scenarios. So what if there is a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports to the US? Well, that would cut Chinese growth by about a half percentage point. But it would cut US GDP growth by about 1.2 percentage points. It's twice
Wow.
as much, and
Right.
also would probably cause inflation to rise by almost 1 percentage point. Now, if we looked at what if the US decided to impose kind of a universal 10% tariff
Mhm.
on all goods, the outcome is pretty much the same. You see weaker US GDP growth, and you also see a drag on global growth because many of economies would be impacted. And essentially, the reason why US growth weakens is because the prices rise for importers, right? Companies who are importing, and then they pass that tax, the customs duty, onto their customers, and ultimately it winds up in consumer inflation. If prices are rising too much or they're too elevated, consumers stop spending, and then businesses don't invest. It's just kind of this ugly,
Right.
um,
Cycle. Yeah.
cycle, negative feedback loop. Meanwhile, other economies may ship fewer goods, or they may even deploy retaliatory actions. All of that just chips away at growth, and the entire global economy doesn't grow as fast because you have economies engaging in these trade wars. But trade wars can be more than just tariffs. You could have export bans where one country says, well, we're not going to ship something to another country. And it could be really critical materials that could gum up the supply chains and the works for the other economy. So there are lots of ways. We could also see currency wars, right? Where if the U.S. does engage in tariffs, you could see the U.S. dollar appreciate. And that causes significant depreciation for economies that are not pegged to the US economy and causes inflation for them. So you could see a lot of things kind of occur, potentially spiral, out of control. But again, you know, all we're hearing right now are pronouncements. And some of these
Right.
pronouncements could just be ways to force other economies and
Uh,
actors
As
to the
as part of
negotiating table,
negotiation. Yes.
but we cannot rule anything out.
Right.
So that's the message that we should warn about.
Absolutely. So besides tariff and trade related policies, when we think about the other policies that might impacts the U.S. economy and the other global economies. How would labor and potential mass deportations have an effect?
Sure. So certainly immigration is a big focus in the U.S. And certainly that was a huge focus for the election itself, where there are pretty significant concerns about undocumented persons in the U.S. And we do know that during the incoming administration's first administration between 2016 and 2020, there was also a big focus on immigration. Back then, the focus was not only on undocumented persons, but also on visas. So, for example, the H-1B visa, a lot of companies use to bring in very highly talented labor
Yeah,
from abroad.
engineers, absolutely.
Exactly. And the focus was, well, you need to source domestically first, and you need to have a really good reason for that visa. So certainly, we do know that beginning in 2025, there's going to be a focus on people who are either undocumented or people who are under temporary protected status or seeking asylum. So anyone who's a TPS person or seeking asylum, they're not illegally here, but they
Right.
are waiting, and they could be turned away. And certainly people who are undocumented could be tracked down and deported. But even if you only see a few actual deportations, the announcement effect could be enough for workers to just disappear, right? They're concerned about their lives, their families, and so they just kind of go into hiding. Some may even exit on their own. But that's going to have material implications for the U.S. labor market, where
Right.
it's going to be very significant for certain industries that are very dependent upon foreign workers, both undocumented and legal. So certainly the financial sector, tech sector, they are dependent, or they tend to use a lot of foreign laborers and seek out those visas. And then certainly for other industries like agriculture, construction, building and maintenance, it may not be the larger companies, hiring undocumented persons because it's illegal. It's illegal to hire
Right.
an
A lot of
undocumented
it is a very
person.
varied.
However, a lot of times it's the contractors,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Your contractors may be hiring people and they're not checking whether or not they're here in the country legally or not. And sometimes just individuals will be hiring people personally, and they don't ask. So we do know that undocumented immigration is embedded in the labor market in the U.S. So there are big questions around, will we see actual immigration reform, or just a big focus on removing persons and also blocking persons from coming into the U.S. Either way, there are pretty serious implications for the labor market if these things happen very quickly and in a grandiose, large way.
Obviously, especially because we have an incoming administration, we have some pronouncements about potential policies, but we don't quite know what's going to happen yet. We're definitely in a level of uncertainty. What sort of advice would you have for our C-suite listeners regarding such an uncertain time period?
Sure. There's just a lot of things that we just don't know. Some of it could be negative for businesses, certainly if you are dependent upon contractors, or you yourself are dependent upon foreign workers. If you are an importer or your supply chains depend upon products that come from abroad, then you're probably focused on tariffs. And so I think, for, companies that may have labor issues, they're going to have to think about, okay, well, who can we upskill? Who can we retrain? Who can we source domestically? Can we tap into, people who are a little bit more difficult to employ? Do we need to automate, look to AI? What do we do around those elements? Certainly for supply chains, as what happened during the 2016-2020 period, many companies had to request exceptions for their imports. And oftentimes they'd have to prove a number of things. For example, is this critical to national security, or is this a hardship for us, or is it a case that we cannot possibly get this part here in the US, it must come from abroad? So that may be happening, but also some companies may accelerate any plans they might have had about reshoring, or even think about building out more production capacity here in the US. But there's also other things that, companies are looking forward to, and that's the potential for deregulation. There's a lot of red tape in the US. Some industries have more red tape than others, so it could potentially help accelerate projects that are weighed down by a lot of different regulations. But guardrails are still good. Guardrails are meant to protect the customer. So hopefully we won't go too far to the point where the lack of rules and guidance results in negative outcomes. Also, there's a big focus on taxes. So it has been floated by the income administration that there could be additional cuts to the corporate tax rate. Arguably, the corporate tax rate in the U.S. is quite competitive compared to other economies. So there could be some diminishing returns in terms of larger federal budget deficits and debt from lowering the tax rate further. But also, there's the expiry of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and there are a number of provisions in there for businesses. So it's probably going to be the case that Congress, along with the administration, will work together to address things like the tax cliff and the debt ceiling. But the cost of extending tax cuts or the cost of suspending or even raising the debt ceiling may be cuts to government spending. And we don't know exactly where that would happen. I would imagine the first place that policymakers may go to would be non-defense discretionary spending. But certainly these are all things that businesses need to keep in mind. On the one hand, there could be some great opportunities, but there could also be some challenges and costs as a consequence of some of the more positive policies that may come down the line.
Okay. Well, this has been so interesting and such an interesting time. Any parting words or closing commentary as we sort of leave November and enter into the holiday season before the next year, Dana?
Sure. Well, just thinking back to the U.S. consumer, we did put out a report in October about spending. And it seems like consumers are still willing to open up their wallets and spend. They're looking to go on vacation. They're looking to give gift cards and trips, that sort of thing, and also buy toys for their kids and their nieces and nephews. So that's all constructive. I mean, although it's the case that we still have not recovered to the amount of real spending, that's spending after accounting for inflation, that we saw before the pandemic, but we're getting better and better every year.
Okay, excellent. Well, Dana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Erin.
And thanks to all of you for listening into C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Erin McLaughlin, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.